All right, so this video is to help you understand how to set up your graph when you're creating a line graph from data that you have collected yourself. And sometimes that data can be really messy. So I'm going to show you the steps on how to do that. The first step when you're creating your own graph on a blank whiteboard like this, on a blank grid, is to identify your variables. So over here in the question that we had was, how does mass affect force? We had two variables. We had one thing that I could change, and that was my independent variable, and that was the number of washers that I was adding into my shoe. So hopefully remember from science that your independent variable, or the thing you can change, always goes on your x-axis, which is the bottom line in your graph. So over here I'm going to go ahead and put mass of washers, because I want to make sure I label my axis, my x-axis in this case, so that people who are looking at my graph later understand it. And then, since mass of washers is my independent variable, my dependent variable is the thing I was measuring, which in this experiment was the pull force. And you always want to make sure you include the unit, and that was in newtons. And the mass of washers over here was in grams. So it was important to include the units and the labels on both sides there. Okay, so now that we've identified our variables and labeled them on the graph, that's kind of our first step. The next one is the hardest part, is to determine the scale for each axis. So sometimes when you have messy data, it's kind of difficult to do this part. So I'm gonna walk you through it step by step. The first step in the process is to look at your actual column of data and try to find your high number and your low number. The high number in this column of data is 175, and the low number is 7.34. So those numbers are really kind of hard to deal with. So what I try to do is I try to find friendly numbers on either end of this range of data to use to actually scale my axis. So my low number is 7.34, and hopefully you remember that when you're labeling an x-axis, you start from the left. That's your low side. So 7.34 is a hard number to work with. So I'm gonna go below 7.34 to 0, because that to me is an easy number to start with. So I'm gonna label this point 0. Then I've got my high number is 175, which actually is kind of a friendly number, but when I actually look at my graph, I notice that there's 4 distinct sections. And I know that if I divide 200 divided by 4, it actually fits into 4 sections really nicely. So I'm going to use 200 as my high number for this range of data because it breaks down into 4 nice sections. So I'm going to put 200 over here, which means that the midpoint between 0 and 200, which is this middle point right here, would be 100. And then, of course, halfway between 100 and 0 is 50. And halfway between 100 and 200 is 150. So now I will be able to include all of this data on the mass of washers on the x-axis. Okay? Then I would proceed to do the exact same thing for my y-axis. So I look back at my data and I see that my lowest number is 2 and my highest number is 4. And actually, those are pretty easy numbers to work with. It's important to notice that you don't actually have to start your graph on 0. So I'm going to go ahead and just use my range of 2 to 4. So I'm going to use my low number is 2, and then my high number is going to be 4 way up here, which means that the midpoint is going to be 3. So if you're looking at your y-axis, between 2 and 4 is all I need to make sure that I include on my graph, and that's all accounted for on the graph. In the next video, I will actually show you how to graph your data once you've set up your axes like this. Oh, last thing is you want to make sure you put a title on here, which we are calling mass versus force, which I got from the question that I was asking myself before I set up the experiment.